This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Serena Olgiati is an expert in human security and armed violence. Her work focuses on measuring and monitoring armed violence in an effort to advance policy and advocacy efforts that promote evidence-based responses to the same. Now an independent professional, most recently she led policy development for the UK-based nonprofit Action on Armed Violence as their head of advocacy. Serena previously worked for the international campaign to ban landmines, representing this organization in Colombia, and for the Cluster Munition Coalition, where she has been actively engaged in the negotiations of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Serena also helped found the Global Alliance on Armed Violence and has supported the creation of local and regional networks, such as the Nigeria Working Group on Armed Violence and the Latin American network, SEHLAC. She holds a master's in international relations from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. I spoke with Serena in Switzerland. Hi, Serena. Thanks so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for giving me this opportunity today.
And where are we calling you today?
You're calling me in Poschiavo in Switzerland, a small village in the Alps.
In the Alps? Wow, in September. I hope that you're still enjoying some fall weather.
Oh, indeed. And very nice weather today.
Excellent. Serena, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you today was because I know that you've recently made the jump to become an independent consultant. Before we talk about that, tell us what it is that you most recently did. You were with Action on Armed Violence, and tell us about that part of your career first.
Yes, so Action on Armed Violence is a UK NGO that works to prevent and reduce armed violence. So we had different types of work we were doing, both at policy level, which was what I was mainly focusing on, but also with different programs in Liberia, Burundi, Sierra Leone. So what we did was, on one side, focusing on some of the weapons and the impact that weapons have on the development of countries and local areas. And on the other side, we also worked with victims of violence. And the area I was particularly engaged with was all the question about using evidence and data to inform action. So that's really what I've spent most of my last years doing. In particular, for example, working with the Small Arms Survey and the Oxford Research Group, the Global Alliance on Armed Violence, to develop a template that countries and local government can use to report on violence and insecurity. So this is a mix of indicators that can help understanding what the impact of violence is locally, but also a chance for countries to promote what they've been doing in terms of programs or actions or policies, and really start building more understanding about the impact that violence has on the development of countries and what really works in order to address it.
What are the 2 or 3 most important findings of that work that you discovered thus far?
Well, I guess the most important one at this stage is that there is a lot that needs to be done. It's very, very difficult to have good data about violence for a number of reasons, really. On one side, as you can understand, it's very sensitive, and governments don't really like to share too much information about violence because there is a belief that you might point the finger of what they've not been doing. But it's also because in some cases it is definitely dangerous to share information about the victims or who has been killed, who has been injured, because of the local realities. So one major finding is that there is a lot of need and a lot of scope to improve the capacities and the understanding of why data on violence is useful and how it can be used. And at the same time, also, I think that compared to possibly other areas of development in the violence agenda, the use of data to evaluate the impact of what you've been doing is not that great because of the challenges with having relevant data. So there is a lot of work that can be done in terms of discussing how you can use data to show the impact of what you've been doing.
Is there you were with Action on Armed Violence for 5 years or so, and you've been thinking about this topic for quite a while. What's the most surprising finding that you have found specific to either small arms or violence or the work that you've been doing? What Can you remember something that you'd made you say, wow, I didn't expect that?
One of the findings, which is by now it's completely known among some people, but not, is the huge amount of violence that happens outside of conflict situations. We have seen, like, for example, what I was really surprised is to see the rates of violence in El Salvador, say, or Jamaica, to be as high as the ones in Iraq during the war. Or, for example, that only 1 in 10 of the violent deaths happen in conflict situations. So all this phenomenon of violence, which, for example, Latin America is very affected of, is quite hidden, and it's not very well recognized, for example, in the donors' agendas and in the donors' plans, which mainly focus on conflict and post-conflict. So this was, for me, one of the main surprises when I started this work. By now, it's not a surprise, but it still is for a lot of people to hear this.
Sure, and so you're saying, when a donor thinks about violence, it's war, essentially. It's
exactly
tanks and helicopters and those kinds of things. But when we think about gang violence, when we think about street violence, those kinds of things, it's just a much more massive problem.
It is massive, and there is a lot less of a coordinated strategy to how to address it.
How did you find yourself in this work? Was this, I'm sort of going back to your university years and those kinds of things, was this something you woke up as a teenager and said, I know that I need to go out and help people, or how did this work find you?
I strongly believe in doing something which I'm passionate about. And this work found me not that much because of its content at the beginning at least, but because of the way it was being done. I strongly believe that if the right people come together, they can achieve pretty much whatever they want. And the first job I had was with the Cluster Munition Coalition, and it was in 2006. So this was the beginning of the coalition, and it was a time where they came together because they saw the impact of cluster munitions on the population and decided that it was time to do something about. And within 2 years of this group working together with states and international organizations, there was a ban on cluster munition, which was for me, amazing. And it really showed me the potential that you have in this area of development, where there are many topics you can work on, but the potential you can have if you just join efforts. And this is something I do in mostly everything I work on. It's always to build partnerships with the local people in order to address whatever I'm working on at the time.
So you actually quite early on had the experience of seeing real effectiveness in the work that you had. I think many people who work in development and aid, that's one of the larger frustrations of it's such a slow change process, or there's so much effort, but there's really very little tangible evidence of change.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was in that sense very lucky to be able to witness that at the beginning. I think some of the work I've been doing now has more a tendency of taking really long time to have an impact because of the approach that I've taken and we've taken with the organization to actually, always sit down with all the partners that have a stake in violence prevention locally, and to start off by building an observatory, gather the data, share the data, and then start informing programs. So this obviously takes quite a lot of time. Mm-hmm. But at policy level, I've seen actually many areas where there was quite a good success. Also with the Arms Trade Treaty, which has just been negotiating. This has taken a lot longer, obviously, than the Cluster Munition Coalition. But I repeatedly see that the people that come together, say with a very clear and specific goal, they tend to achieve what they are looking for. Sometimes what I feel like in the development area is that the goals are a bit blurry, if you want, or there are so many things that people aim to achieve with one thing that you lose a bit the focus. And I think that is part of why sometimes things don't move forward as fast.
I'm glad to hear you say that. That's one of the things we champion here at Aidpreneurs. Pick one thing, make that your thing, and just do that and make change that way. That's fantastic. One of the things that I'm sure some of our listeners are trying to get a grasp of is They just heard you say that you've really, you've affected policy change. You've had the arms trade treaty. You've had the ban on cluster munitions. Paint a picture for me about what did that really mean in your profession. Were you sitting around the Security Council, negotiating, or were you one of hundreds of people working on this? I think that there's a mythology about how these things get done. And tell us what your specific, role in that machine was.
Well, it was different in different one, but mainly I was one in all of them. I was one of many people doing the work. So the Cluster Munition Coalition was over 300 organizations. What I was doing specifically was coordinating the work in Latin America. So like deciding some advocacy strategies that would work regionally and then start to promote that. And so most of it was really an advocacy work, sit down with the government, sit down with the people in capital, discuss specific political issues that they might have with the content of the treaty, this kind of thing. So it was a lot of advocacy, really. But it was always done in collaboration with many other peoples.
Were you able to come to a moment where you got to witness the treaty being signed, or were you, half a world away while, official policymakers were signing a treaty or something like that?
No, we were there. We were actually there. I was there. I was able to sit in with the Foreign Ministry of Switzerland to see her sign the treaty. And it was definitely a very emotional moment when you work on it for so long and so intensely. So we were definitely at the UN during the negotiations, which meant that we could, in certain cases, provide a lot of intelligence and technical support to the countries. I think that was something that was particularly striking for me, is that you become the expert. And often when the government representative negotiating these treaties, in many cases, they don't have a lot of experts that they can take with them for the content and the substance. So some of the NGOs became really a content provider to the governments in terms of the negotiations. So it was a very, very close collaboration with some of them. Obviously, with others it was a bit more challenging.
So that's really where I wanted to go next. What sort of challenges are faced when you are an advocate in that way, especially when you're working on something as substantial as an international treaty? Were there moments when it looked like it was going to fall apart? What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced, not only as a coalition, but just, getting people to the table?
Well, there are, since some of these processes, it depends, right? For example, the Arms Trade Treaty was done within the UN system, so all the states were there. And so you were faced with very, very different positions on the purpose of weapons or the impact of weapons. And so it takes a mix of diplomatic skills and political leverage, really, to achieve what you want to do. So when you have countries that are completely opposed to your goals, you need to find the right people that can convey the message. So there will be certain states that they will be listening more than others, for example. Or in certain cases, you can have entire regions going and talking to one specific countries. And so you need to find the right approach in order to manage to get those countries on board. When it happens outside the UN, like the Cluster Munition or the Landmine Ban Treaty, which was negotiated outside the UN, you have a stronger voice as a civil society in terms of conveying your messages. You have more room into the negotiating tables, actually, to be able to promote what you want to say. So you have less work to do outside the conference room, if you want.
Help me understand the difference of negotiating something inside the UN and outside the UN. Obviously, both end up being just as valid a process, but why would you choose one path over the other?
The main reason is that sometimes, if you are within the UN, then you work in a consensus. And that means that every state, depending on the definition, but mostly every state in the room will need to agree on the text and the content in order for the text to be adopted and become legally binding. So for a treaty to be very strong and to have very strong humanitarian clauses in it, you might need to negotiate it outside the UN, where you know that some of the countries that will in any case oppose any reference to humanitarian impact or any reference to support to victims, for example, cannot oppose it. So it's a strategic move. If you move it outside the UN, you will probably have a stronger humanitarian treaty in terms of its content, but you will not have certain countries on board. So, for example, if suddenly you find yourself with none of the producers of weapons or none of the users into your treaty, then the treaty will not be very strong in any case, even if it has very high humanitarian clauses. So it's a choice you need to strike between who you are targeting and the strength of the treaty, really.
You've talked about a couple of fairly significant successes, the coalition, or the Landline Coalition and the Arms Treaty. Can you tell me about a time when either you personally or the organization you were working for just completely failed, fell on its face, and what you did about that in order to turn things around or take the next step?
A time where we completely failed, I don't really recall any time where we actually failed completely in what we wanted to achieve.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. That's the best answer, right?
I was actually very lucky. I don't recall a time where I could say like that really went wrong.
Okay, no worries. Then let me ask a different question. And this will start to take us in the direction of you as an independent consultant now. Is what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced working for an organization such as Action on Armed Violence? You were an employee for them. What were some of the frustrations while you were working on these important issues?
One was more of a personal frustration. The main one, which is also the main reason why I decided then to move into consultancy, is that I did not have a lot of control over my time. I was traveling a lot. And I really felt like I couldn't really manage my time the most efficiently, both in the terms of the time I was away and the time I could then not do other projects I would like to do, but also because you work, basically 9 to 5 when you're lucky, which doesn't happen often, but you work on a specific timetable every day. And so I personally, because of my personality and the way I work best, was struggling to be efficient all the time. I prefer to set my time and set my goals and then work towards that instead of telling myself I need to be at my desk from 9 to 5, for example. So one frustration I had is this need to be there, depend at every day, every time, at the same time, instead of working really with the way I work best and at the times where I work best.
Sure. So less results oriented and more basically just time function.
Yes, often yes.
And how have you, was there a moment when you realized that evidence, was where you wanted to take your career? Was there an aha moment you're like, this is the most important thing for me?
Well, funnily enough, it came with time. I actually would not have thought myself as loving data and all these kind of more nerdy things, if you want.
Hey, we love nerds. They're all good.
Exactly, we do. And actually, I do. And I realized how much I love this. But then, for me, what was important and where I was feeling that this was really a key aspect to me is that quite a few policy and programs decision being taken based on what people believed the problem was, what the political agenda dictated that the problem was, and not really based on what the evidence was really showing. So when I started working, for example, with my colleagues in Burundi, and I sat down with the police there and with the army and the Ministry of Defense, and they started discussing, why it was helpful to share data and how they could use it, I really realized the potential that it has and how it can improve what people are doing. I was actually surprised about the amount of decisions that are taken on the basis of, well, different things, but not evidence.
So personality-driven, opinion-driven, mood of the day, basically?
Exactly, mainly or politically driven. So not many about evidence. So that's what I really saw, that if you want to be more effective and also channeling better all the money that is going towards supporting different programs, you need to improve your understanding.
And so you've taken the decision to move to independent consultancy. You had alluded to a couple of things about the challenges you were facing, use of your time, those kinds of things. Was there a moment, then sort of that aha moment, as we like to say, where you said, you know what, this is it, I'm ready to make the jump?
It wasn't really a specific moment. It's something that I was thinking in my mind, and that I built it up, if you want. It wasn't something suddenly I said, oh, that's it. It's with the time I knew that I wanted to be able to better manage my time. And also, I think mainly, I believe that after a while, it is good to get out of your bubble. I felt personally that I was losing a bit of my creativity and putting myself on the spot. You know, when you feel a bit too comfortable about what you're doing and you must start replicating. And I always told myself, because I saw that happening many times, that I would avoid replicating things or just sitting in my position and just take everything for granted, because that's what I've been doing in the last years. So it was a choice also in that sense. I think it's important for my creativity and my passion to move on, and also, throw myself a bit into the unknown.
So tell us then, I think it's fantastic that this was really sort of a prepared process for you. Take me through, what did you do to prepare? How, did you start saving money? Did you announce to people and say, hey, I'm going to be going independent in 6 months or 1 year? And did you start to build a network? Do you have a contract that you already landed before you left? What are those tools and pieces that you put together? I
definitely cultivated my contacts. I was luckily because I work in partnerships and build up partnerships, and that's what my expertise is, to have a lot of contacts and a lot of people that know how I work and that appreciate that. So I started, looking at opportunities to take some of the projects that I've been working on, maybe look at other opportunities, just discuss whether people would be interested in doing some consultancy with me on some of the stuff that we have done, on new projects. So it was kind of testing to see the interest of organizations in working with consultants, whether it was me or others, but just really looking a bit at the market that there was around in the areas that I'm working on, and the interest of people to work with consultants and what was good or not. I spoke with some consultants that do this type of work, and they gave me great recommendations about, what is challenging, how to move forward. So all that I was able to do in preparation, really, if you want.
Can you share some of those challenges, like maybe one of the two that really stuck out in your mind about, wow, I need to look out for that?
I guess one that was very interesting, the one person told me, never undersell yourself. And the challenge that was not a challenge in itself, but I guess the challenge of knowing what you're worthy and how to present what you're worthy. It's quite tricky, more than actually other things I found. It's really, what are you worthy and how do you sell that, really? I found it very interesting and in some areas quite challenging.
And have you already put together a strategy for how you're able to communicate that?
No, I'm working on that now, because what I decided to do when I quit AOAB was to take few months for myself to build my next move. So I really consciously wanted to have some time off where I could focus on these things, because I want to avoid just roll into projects or specific things just because they are there. I really want to have the time to think through, what am I passionate about? Is this still what I want to work on? And how do I work to do that? So I took this time off to do that. And I also organized myself so that I don't only rely on the consultancy. So I have some other projects that have nothing to do with development and aid and armed violence prevention that I want to build up. And I have started building up so that I don't rely exclusively on either of those things, which allows me a bit more of a room to actually, really take up things that I'm passionate about.
Can you, are you willing to tell us what some of those other projects are? Are they creative outlets or something completely different? Or?
Oh, they're completely different. They go into massages and use of energy, and it's more of an individual work that I do. So it is not much to do with the consultancy work I do, apart that it allows me to understand people very well.
Awesome. So as you are taking these couple of months to build this foundation for yourself and really take the time to know what your message is and put it out there, tell us about how you right now are thinking about you're going to structure your work. Do you want to have a portfolio of small projects that you continue to work on? Do you think you'll want to work for one big client for 6 months at a time, or what do you think your preference will be?
I think my preference will be to start off to have more than one client. In terms of the length, I do believe that I would like to have projects where I really have the time to work with the client on the recommendations we might come up with and the implementation of it. I saw some cases where, consultant comes in, does a review or an evaluation, leaves and writes a report, and then that's it. And nothing really happens afterwards. Whereas I saw, particularly when we were working in Burundi, if you actually take the time to work and sit down with the people and really start implementing your recommendation with them and give them the time to integrate them, then they really make a difference. So I don't have a preference really on the time length, but I will want something where I have the time to look at this implementation as well.
Are there tools or techniques or particular skills that either from maybe your education or that you picked up when you were at AOAV, or they're just things that that you've used that help you to be particularly effective either as an advocate or that you're going to use in your independent consultancy that you think are just sort of one of your game changers? One
thing I definitely always do, whether it is going into negotiation or preparing for a meeting or whatever, is to find some background information or talk to people that might know the person or might know the organization. So the build up and the intelligence I can gather before I go into a discussion, whatever the discussion is, I think in some cases was really a game changer, especially when you are negotiating and the characteristic of the person you will have in front or some of the interests. It's really something that makes my life a lot easier at the time of having an impact in what I'm talking about. So I do spend quite a lot of time preparing myself beforehand with different information.
Sure, preparation is key. Huh? Thanks. Two more questions for you. One, and both I ask every guest here in terms of reference. The first one is, if you and I right now we're sitting together in the Alps, either having a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, there's that one story that we usually tell one another, or as we're sitting around just sharing stories. Can you think of that that one story about either a time you were inspired or you saw incredible change? I'm thinking like Burundi or something like that you usually tell people about when you were really affected by something that was happening in your work?
There are numbers. I think one person that inspired me particularly name is Branislav Kapetanovic, and he was in the Serbian army. And he was defusing a cluster munition when it exploded, so he lost both his arms and legs, and he has become one of the advocates of the Cluster Munition Coalition. And I think a person that has taught me immensely many things really about life and how to approach life. And one of these persons that reminds me of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And like him, I've met many really around in my trips, and it's always these people that can go through life with a smile and a lot of strength, no matter what they have been through. So that's definitely him and many others.
I'll make sure that his name appears on your on this post here, so that people can look him up and share in that inspiration. Thanks for sharing that. The last question I always ask every guest here in terms of reference is, there are a lot of people listening right now who are either thinking about transitioning their career into development or humanitarian aid, or have just completed a master's degree, or maybe they're already professionals but they want to get better. What's your critical piece of advice that you give people about how to be successful in this profession?
The main one is be really clear about what you want. So take the time to think and imagine what your work would look like, what you want to work, how you want to work. And the second one is never be shy to ask for advice and reach out to people. I do think that a lot of opportunities come from talking to people and connecting to people, a lot more than spending times on websites or just sending out CVs without really thinking about what you want to achieve. So my two advice would be really clear about what you want and spend time reaching out to the right people or just presenting yourself and talking to people.
Serena, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fantastic interview.
Thank you very much to you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.